discussion topics, we're talking about our research topics. So my topic is the importance of foreign European officers to the Continental Army and its success against the British. So the Continental military situation at the beginning of the war was pretty bad. So we didn't have a standing army in America. We relied on the militia for our peacekeeping forces throughout the colonies, and most of these militia units were not very experienced. They may have been used in like some ad hoc skirmishes or when problems would arise throughout the colonies, but very, very few of them had any real military experience. And the ones that did had gotten that experience during the French and Indian War, where they served either independently as a unit against the French or the Indians, or they were assigned to regular British Army units where they supplemented their troop strength in different conflicts. And it's that latter situation where you find gentlemen like George Washington, who was ended up being chosen to command the Continental Army, but he had been a colonel in the Virginia militia, and he had served with the British regular army on several expeditions, and he actually petitioned for a commission in the British Army. It ended up being refused, thankfully, but the guys that did have some fighting, some warfare experience were very, very few, and usually that was that type of situation. So Congress they're hesitant to build a standing army for a couple of reasons. One, when you have an army, you have to feed an army, you have to house an army, and that was some of the problems that they had with the British Army being in the colonies to begin with. So that was one reason. Another reason is you elect someone to be in charge of an army, and there's a big army, and the war is over. Does that person step aside, or do they declare themselves king or dictator? So there was a fear that that could possibly happen. But the common opinion with Washington and a lot of the other military leaders, the army leaders, was that they had to have a regular army. It was desperately needed because they were going to be fighting the British. And Washington, as part of the Washington Papers, he actually wrote a letter to John Hancock, and in that letter he quoted that unless some speedy and effectual measures are adopted by Congress, our cause is lost. And that was just after a small amount of time of him observing the militia. He felt like we are in trouble if this is the force that we have to fight the British with. So Congress's initial answer was just to rename some of the militia units around Boston as the Continental Army, and that's great. But the large percentage of that army is still militia; they're not professional soldiers. So Eric Spall actually writes an article called "Foreigners in the Highest Trust: American Perceptions of European Mercenary Officers in the Continental Army," and he estimated that of the 730,000 men that served in the Continental Army during the war, that 90% of those were militiamen. That's a large percentage of unprofessional troops that you have serving in your army, and their enlistments were very, very short. They were only 30, 90 days, maybe up to a year. That is not a lot of time to train a soldier to be a professional fighting man. After 1778, at least through some petitioning with Congress, the army enlistments were lengthened to 3 years and sometimes until the end of the war. But desertion continued to still be a huge problem because a lot of these militia units, like I said before, they just didn't like to be disciplined. So throughout the war, discipline in the troops was a big problem because it would just cause these guys to go home if they didn't like how they were being treated or just didn't want to endure the conditions anymore. So the British, on the other hand, is one of the most professional fighting armies in the world. They were experienced from decades of warfare, really in some cases almost a century of warfare throughout Europe. And also in the colonies. They had just finished fighting a big war in the colonies. And British military policy was to supplement their standing forces with hired professional soldiers from other European nations. And in the case of the American Revolution, this was mostly German soldiers, which we nicknamed Hessians, to the tune of about 19,000 in 1776 alone. And throughout the war, it ended up being about 30,000 Germans saw service in the colonies. So how did Continental Congress and the Army offset this experience gap? Well, we did something that we criticized the British for doing. We hired professional soldiers. So some of these men were at the end of their European military careers and were looking to continue to earn a living. Some of them were young and looking for fortune and fame and adventure, and some had just heard about the American cause of liberty, and they wanted to come and be a part of that and fight and help America win its independence. Some of them left Europe with letters from Benjamin Franklin asking Congress to give them a commission based off the experience that they had. But some just left and got to America and made their way to Philadelphia and went before Congress and said, "This is me, this is who I am, this is what I can offer you, will you give me a commission?" So they brought some important things with them. They brought experience because some of these guys had been military officers for decades. They brought funding. In one case, a French nobleman named Charles Armand, he was given the rank of colonel in the Continental Army. He was given permission to go and raise a legion of troops to lead. He tried recruiting. It didn't work. He flat out purchased a troop of a legion of troops from another Swiss gentleman who had managed to recruit these guys. So some of these guys had pretty deep pockets. They would buy equipment and horses and other things that their units desperately needed. And they also brought political leverage, especially in the case of the French. They could report back to the people they knew in France. This is how things are going. This is how the American cause looks, and so on. And that influenced France's decision to support the colonies. So one significant, and probably the most significant gentleman who was a Prussian military officer, he was serving Frederick the Great's army. He comes to America with no commission, no promise of a commission. He goes before Congress. This is me. This is what I can do for you. He does have a letter from Benjamin Franklin, so that's pretty important. But he wasn't guaranteed anything, and so he links up with George Washington at Valley Forge, and immediately he turns to training soldiers in the Prussian way. And this impressed Washington. And although he could not give him the official Inspector General title at the time because it was already taken by somebody else, he appointed him as the acting Inspector General. And so he also allowed him to gather up about 100 troops, some from Washington's personal lifeguard, some from other units from other areas that were also there at Valley Forge. And he put these guys through the basics, right? How to stand at attention, how to form in a line, how to hold your weapon, how to train as a platoon, as a company, as a regiment, etc. And he wrote a manual on discipline, and it ended up being, the Army called it the Blue Book, and they used that to train Army units all the way up through 1814. So it was good stuff. And when that company was as good as von Steuben could get it, they went back to the units that they had came from originally and acted as a cadre to train those guys in the Prussian way. This is how we fight. This is how we come together and merge and fight as one unit. And that allowed Washington to come out of Valley Forge with a much more disciplined and lethal army that got more victories and could fight the British to a standstill, and was able to carry the fight all the way through the end of the war. So that's it in a nutshell, right? Hopefully you got from that a lot of these European officers that were recruited into the Continental Army, they were important and they did good things. This is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a very, very interesting subject, and I hope that this piqued your interest. These are just a couple of the references that I found while researching this project, and I hope this encourages you to go out and look into it some more for yourself, because there's some really great stories about some really interesting people out there. My name's Lawrence Bostic, and thank you for listening. Good luck with your projects.